welcome everyone. Um, I think what I was going to do is first of all just introduce very briefly each of our panelists, and then very kindly Pancho from McKinsey will put up a slide that will really set the scene to an extent of what we're going to talk about later. So can I just go around the screen first of all and introduce Afsaneh Jetta, who's the managing partner and CEO and also the founding shareholder of Alta Semper Capital. Next, I've got Abhishek Sharma, who is also the CEO of Foundation Holdings, which is a strategic global investment firm. Dr. Pancho Georgiev, I hope I pronounced that properly, who's the head of the healthcare practice, healthcare services, and systems at McKinsey in the MENA region. And also Dr. Cyril Toma, who's the managing partner of ICME Healthcare. And both Cyril and Pancho are medical doctors, so hopefully there's a degree of experience from there as well. And just introducing myself, my name is Hamid Yunus. I'm the managing partner in London of McDermott, Will & Emery. We are a large international law firm, and of interest is really 30% of our work is drawn from the life sciences and healthcare field. So before going on to the slide that I mentioned earlier, I thought I'd go around the panelists again and they can introduce their organizations and their experience a little bit more. So again, can I start with you, Afsaneh?
Sure. Thank you. And it's such a pleasure to be part of such an esteemed panel and to be talking about something about which we at Alta Semper are very passionate, healthcare and healthcare investing. So I'm the managing partner of a business called Alta Semper Capital, which is a specialist investor in the healthcare, consumer, and sort of disruptive and enabling technology sectors across North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. We are one of the, I guess, more active investors in the healthcare space. We've deployed roughly $150 million over the last 3 years in market-leading control healthcare businesses. We tend to invest in large businesses that we believe can scale, generally in market-leading businesses, and specifically businesses that we feel also provide not only strong financial returns to our investors, but also lasting and meaningful positive social externality, because many of these businesses are quite key to the markets in which they invest, and healthcare increasingly, especially in sort of a post-COVID world, is an increasingly sort of systematic part of markets. And we invest on behalf of family offices, DFIs, financial institutions, and are very particularly bullish on the healthcare investment space in the coming horizon.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Afsaneh. Abhishek, would you like to go next?
Thank you, Amit. So in our case, Foundation Holdings is a multi-family office focused on healthcare and education. The firm was set up 4 years ago, and our thesis has been that healthcare and education can solve global problems. And in this case, we're seeing this, as Afsaneh said, we're at the epicenter of this change, and we want to be more than spectators in this global change. Obviously, as a firm itself, because of the firm focus, what we've seen in the GCC and India, which is the markets that we play in, we specialize in pre-IPO transactions, companies which have the growth, the brand, and the scale, but often are lacking or need a helping hand to take it up a notch. So that's been our track record of working with companies with a lot of potential and helping them leapfrog competition to reach that IPO journey, whether it's New York, London, or Dubai. That's been what it is. We have investments in healthcare in Saudi Arabia, in UAE, and in India as we speak today.
Thank you, Abhishek. Pancho, do you want to go next?
Sure. Thank you, Hamid. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. So we as McKinsey, we are a global consulting firm. We are a partnership. Within EMA, healthcare is about 15% of what we do in terms of the sectors that we're serving. We are working with both public and private institutions on a whole suite of topics, as you probably know. The focus in EMA for us has been, or in MENA for us has been predominantly over the last years to support governments with the design and implementation of healthcare reforms, and some of the private sector players in setting up their transformations and executing against those. A team of about 100 people across MENA that are doing healthcare work on an ongoing basis. Pleasure to be with all of you today.
Thank you, Pancho. Pleasure to see you as well. And Cyril, would you like to go next?
Yes, thank you, Hamid. Also, to everyone, pleasure to be here. Cyril Toma, I'm the managing partner for ICME Healthcare for the MENA region. We're based in Abu Dhabi. ICME is a strategic healthcare consultancy firm. We were founded in Zurich, Switzerland in 1954 and have been in the GCC since 2007. We're a strategic healthcare advisory firm, but on top of that have a strong engineering arm where we do health facility planning, both from a strategic as well as from an engineering perspective. We focus on health technology assessment in partnership with the ECRI Institute in the United States, and also health technology planning and advisory. And also engaged in a number of mandates for governments in the GCC as well as the private sector to hook them up with global operators that are interested to come into the region to operate healthcare facilities. So that's a part of our practice. Our geographic focus as ICME is the DACH region, so Austria, Germany, Switzerland, Eastern and Southeastern Europe, as well as the Middle East. One of our subsidiaries focuses on e-health specifically and how e-health can be integrated into a new healthcare landscape. We look at the regulatory framework, we look at reimbursement models, we look at technology and how e-health solutions could be implemented and how the care model needs to be adapted in order for e-health to really succeed. So these are just a few snippets of what we do. I'm an orthopedic surgeon by training and have been in the consulting field for the past 10 years. Yeah.
Thank you, Cyril. That's absolutely fantastic. And I think there's a sort of diverse group of panelists that hopefully can give some perspective and experience from the wider MENA region, which actually, there's always a conversation as to how we define MENA, so I'm going to leave that for now. But I thought what would be helpful, and Pancho has very kindly agreed to do this, is put up a slide that refers to some global trends and see how they can be adapted to the MENA market and are being implemented in the MENA market. And I thought the rest of our panel, we could develop some of these themes and also look at some of the trends that we're seeing in the MENA region. So, Pancho, do you want to take us through this one and set the scene?
Sure, very happy to. Thanks, Hamid. So look, what I thought I'll do to just frame up a bit, share a little bit of a perspective across 7 themes that we are probably all observing globally, and give a little bit of color of what we are observing across the MENA region with some examples to get us started. So the first one is the active consumer. Of course, the buzzword that is used a lot, but just to give you a bit of a sense of what we're seeing, in our latest healthcare consumer survey that we ran in the last quarter in Saudi and in the UAE, for example, right? 60% of people today would say that they'd rather book an appointment online than call a provider. 70% of them would search the internet on a condition before they go and see a physician. And 60% expect to have a digital app that helps them to manage their electronic health records or their medical files themselves. This is starkly different from what we would have seen only 3-4 years ago. So people really start to engage with this media in a very, very different way. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is data and analytics, another thing that is obviously on top of everybody's mind. And we're thinking about, clinical decision support. We're thinking about risk assessment of payers and being much more targeted about where to intervene. And the challenges that we are seeing globally, but also in our part of the world, are mostly at this stage around regulation and insufficient regulation to define what we can actually do with the data. And again, something that has broader implications for how this is going to go going forward, and we may want to discuss. The third topic is around the obvious emergence and growth of telemedicine and maybe more broadly digital health. But just to give you again a bit of a flavor of what we saw in the last quarter in our healthcare consumer survey, where we polled 1,000 people in Saudi and 1,000 in the UAE, to get a bit of a sense of how this is moving. So 40% of people had used some form of telehealth. 60% are saying that they're willing to use it. And what I find interesting is more than 95% of people who have used the telehealth offering are very satisfied with the experience. And that despite that happening in a time where a lot of the technology was only just set up, people were using a lot of relatively simple tools, because this was 3-4 months ago. And so people are already very happy with that experience. So we can only imagine where this journey can go. The fourth trend is new competitor landscapes, or partnerships. And I mean, globally, we're seeing obviously things like Aetna and CVS mergers and other things, but we're also seeing in the region an approximation of partners that wouldn't have traditionally worked with each other. Suddenly, joint efforts of payers and providers is on the table. Sovereign wealth funds that are looking into new sets of partnerships. So I think this is also something that is becoming very, very dynamic, and an integration across the value chain is what we're starting to observe. The fifth thing is new economic models, or if you want, new reimbursement models. Also something that is very actively happening in our region, with obviously Dubai and finally the rollout of DRGs, Abu Dhabi with the announcement of going to outpatient bundles, which is not something that we've seen in many places yet successfully done, but we're going there. Or Saudi Arabia, that is going towards a capitation model for its entirety of the public sector, following the steps of some of the US ACOs and some of the things that are happening in the UK. So clearly a trend towards innovating and going where the rest of the world is going as well on the reimbursement models. The sixth thing is automation. And just to cite an example here in the work that we've done as part of the McKinsey Global Institute report on automation of the workforce, 1/3 of activities in healthcare can be automated today with the tools that we have available today, right? So the impact that we expect could have on addressing some of the workforce challenges like nurse shortages starts to become much more concrete, but also the pressure on productivity is something that becomes quite interesting to reflect upon in view of our ability to automate. And the seventh topic is probably the buzzword for me of the year, is ecosystems. Suddenly everybody is speaking about ecosystems. And I think over the last 6-9 months, the amount of conversations that we've had about building ecosystems is just insane, right? And we're speaking about sovereign wealth funds, family offices, private investors, payers, providers. Everybody is looking into this and starting to do something in the field. And so I think a concept that has been around for quite a while has suddenly become very, very prominent also in our part of the world. We're not only speaking of digital ecosystems, but truly online, offline integrated systems that are starting to at least conceptually emerge. It's going to be interesting to see what happens on that front over the next year or two. So let me pause here. So I think these are a bit the 7 topics that I wanted to put out there as a frame and a little bit of color of high-level observations. Hamid, over to you.
Pancho, that's absolutely brilliant. I mean, I would agree with all those 7 highlights, in a sense, the trends that we're seeing around the globe, actually, not just in the MENA region. Cyril, I was just going to go to you first and say, in your experience, I mean, are you seeing anything else, or do those 7 trends, because there are so many sub-trends as well, do you see that as encapsulating what's happening in the MENA region?
I think, first of all, Pancho, that was really good in summary. I like that, but I think what we also need to look at is at individual organizations, individual investors, and how they're reacting to the current situation. This situation was unprecedented. This is a term that you do hear quite often, and people are now trying to digest what happened. And what it also showed is it clearly showed the weaknesses in individual systems, be it weaknesses in management systems, be it weaknesses in how much investment was done in technology. And I strongly believe that this is going to impact decision-making moving forward. People are now in the analysis mode of what has occurred. They are in a reactive mode, trying to, especially the private sector, with outpatient numbers falling rapidly. We're talking 8 million outpatients less per week in the GCC compared to pre-pandemic scenarios. So that does have quite a significant impact. Looking into the future, people are now closely watching the trends and discussing them internally. And they're seeing that, okay, e-health is something that is going to have more and more acceptance, is going to be used. Patients are super happy with this. It's easy for them to access care that way, but they will analyze the regulatory environment. They will analyze how they can get reimbursed, and they will analyze what technology investments they are going to need. So at this point in time, there is a lot of analysis ongoing, and people are striving towards operational efficiencies. And when they say that, they mean often say that they want to improve care, they want to, all of that is true, but the bottom line is people really need to save money at this point in time. Yeah, so these internal processes is something that is happening, and across all of the 7 things that Panko mentioned to us, and listening to providers, listening to private and public healthcare sector providers is important, because we keep hearing that echo from them.
Thank you, Cyril. I just want to develop one point that you said, but under the umbrella of what Pancho had commented on. Afsane, just turning to you in terms of, in those trends that we're seeing, do you see a growing opportunity for investors in those sort of global trends, and do you see some of those aspects of being much more interest to you in your healthcare funds as opposed to other areas?
Absolutely. No, I'm always in awe of how very senior people at McKinsey can compress so much dense, useful information to a very simple slide. So that was great. No, but I think I would totally agree. And we see, I guess taking a step back, we invest both in North Africa, MENA, and Sub-Saharan Africa. And one of our biggest trends, and the thing about which probably we have the most conviction, is the next big meaningful disruption on the continent is going to be that of medtech. Whether it's AI-based imaging, whether it's telemedicine, whether it's drones, delivering medication, blood, things like that. We really see that as accelerating very rapidly, and we do see it as being eventually as impactful as the mobile phone itself, as fintech itself, especially as people tend to place a huge amount of effort or importance on the access to affordable, high quality healthcare. I think across, so some of the, we have 2 portfolio companies, large portfolio companies in North Africa. One is the leading medicated cosmetics, low acuity genera pharma business in Egypt. And the other is the country's first and arguably largest vertically integrated oncology, radiology, and diagnostics business. It's a group of 11 clinics. And I would say probably for the latter, these have all been quite interesting. I think probably the biggest trend has been the shift towards kind of precision medicine. So for example, precision medicine and sort of precision diagnostics. So, historically, if you had pancreatic cancer, and which is a very aggressive form of cancer, everyone gets chemotherapy. It turns out, and apologies to the medics on the line if I'm not getting this quite right, but I'm told that only 40% of people with pancreatic cancer actually react to traditional chemotherapy. And so if you had access to sort of genetic testing or precision medicine, you would be able to kind of parse out the 60% of people who aren't going to react to chemotherapy and provide them with, genetic therapy or accelerate their transplant opportunities, or something where you can slice treatments based on sort of more precise diagnostics. And we see that as a huge trend across our businesses, and we see it as a great opportunity to provide higher efficacy, and ultimately like lower cost products, because you're not really wasting therapeutic cost on sort of diseases that don't react to that. So we see that as a huge trend. And probably the other trend is really just sort of the trend around telemedicine, digital medicine, especially in kind of a post-COVID world where there are risks around, physically going to a doctor's office or physically going for a consultation. And so we are seeing that as a trend across all of our businesses, where people are now doing, cancer treatments over telemedicine. They're, doing wearables to monitor their blood pressure and et cetera. So they have to sort of interact less face to face, but it also in a way massively extends the ability to reach the last mile, because it's and people always laugh when I say this, but for quite some time, I compare hospitals sort of to the telecom industry 10 years ago, right? It's a bit of, there's such a huge amount of CapEx involved per subscriber. And historically, the way you would get access to telecoms is you just build a tower every couple kilometers, where you don't really have to do that anymore when you have, access to telemedicine, access to precision medicine, where you can actually leverage the CapEx you're spending over a much broader population without having to build the physical space. And so we see that as being able to massively expand the accessible market and provide, again, lower quality, arguably lower cost, higher quality products to people who aren't necessarily living in dense urban centers.
Sani, that's very, very helpful. I mean, some elements there to develop on as we're going forward. But Abhishek, I was going to ask almost the same question to you in terms of, having looked at Pancho's very helpful slide about global trends, but wearing a hat as an investor, let's say, looking for opportunities, would you agree with a lot of what Sani has said, or are there things that you want to add on to that?
Yes, I guess in this case, right, I guess the job of an investor or a good investor is to spot potential, because I wish we could get retroactive dividends, but we don't. So we can only get what's in the future. And at least, maybe I'll simplify the conversation, which, as someone who's very closely involved with insurance companies and government and key stakeholders, what do we see? The number one concern on a mass scale for most insurance companies today in the GCC, and I'm talking specifically also Saudi and UAE, and the government, is cost. So, while they're amazing concepts and technology and this and that, deep down, if we just put some figures around to what we're talking about, right? And let me take Saudi as an example. 33 million people, 62% Saudi, 38% non-Saudi. 75 years is the life expectancy. And sometimes people are surprised that it's a decent age. Now, Saudi has a very large belly. And the pun is, why is it at such a large belly? Children under 5 are 8% of the population, and people over 65 years only 3%. So you have 90% in that, call it that bracket. 10% of the entire budget is already being spent on healthcare. You're talking big numbers, 200 billion Saudi riyals, which is $50 billion. Why am I mentioning all of this? While it sounds exciting that there's a lot of dollars that's spent, this is where then costs become a key issue. In the day and age that we're in, with oil and geopolitical pressures, the government has openly said that the private sector participation in Saudi Arabia, for example, has to increase, which it was 25% private sector 2016 to today 35% to then 50%. So at least from our side, the single biggest theme we are seeing is literally to do with how can you do more with less. And again in Saudi, just as sticking to that, it's the land of hospitals, 500 hospitals, 75,000 beds. But really the opportunity and where we're spending a lot of time ourselves as investors, primary healthcare, where the government is doing 13 million outpatient visits, but healthcare today, the thesis at Foundation is like a dumbbell. Either it's very complex tertiary, or you go on the wellness and the primary care side. So for us, any of even the technology plays, they have to come under one of the themes, which is how do you actually enable it to be cost effective, and of course affordability, access, quality go hand in hand. But for us, that's the segment where we're focused on the mid to lower segment often. And that's the biggest theme we're seeing. Insurance is the same. Give us a cost-effective, reliable solution. The government's the same. How do you take cost out of the ecosystem or the system? That's what we hear simplistically.
I think one of the points you just made there, Abhishek, from my own experience, I mean, we were involved in quite a large M&A transaction at the beginning of the year. Actually, it closed in January, thank God. But one of the big risk factors for the purchaser, which was a private equity house, was the certainty of reimbursement. And I wouldn't mind if we can, I mean, I think that's a theme that's going to be common to all of us, that if, let's say, and in any country, the risk of reimbursement, and whether you can have a solidified reimbursement where you can predict what the pattern of reimbursement will be, is an important concern. But Pancho, back to you in terms of, do you consider that the region has got better at having some kind of certainty as to how reimbursement would work going forward, be it from a government or a quasi-government authority or a health authority, or from insurance, or even private payers as well?
It's a great question, Hamid, and I think I'm always thinking of the poor analysts that have to put a revenue line when they are assessing these assets, right? And with all the assumptions that you have to make around it. I think we're gradually getting there, and we're of course, this is a market that is still developing and maturing. But if you think about it, 10 years ago, this was all wild one-to-one negotiations if there is a payer to a provider. I think now we probably have we have some of the systems that have stability over a number of years, like Abu Dhabi, Dubai is getting there. And then you have an emergence of DRGs being rolled out in Saudi, and at least minimum data sets that are being defined for CCHI, etc. So I think we're maturing. It's still a journey. But I think the real difficulty at this stage relates to what Abhishek just said before. Governments are facing costs that have gotten completely out of their hand. And there is only 2 or 3 things that you can do. You can cut tariffs, you can control volumes through benefit packages, and you can, if you can and want to, control the supply. Because most of them have realized that the 500 hospitals that Abhishek mentioned in Saudi are, of course, way more than Saudi will need in the next 20 years. And they start to realize that, but that's really hard to cut down. So what you can do is you can work on tariffs, and you can work on volumes through benefit packages. And in reality, not much has happened yet. I mean, a little bit in Abu Dhabi has started, but this is still very early days. So I would expect that we will get much more clarity and stability over the next 2-3 years. But I would also expect that over the next 2 or 3 years, we will see some quite drastic changes that are not going to be necessarily beneficial for providers. Because the governments are becoming more sophisticated in understanding that in some aspects they're paying way too much, and it's not that difficult to find out and to start to correct. So I think we are probably 2-3 years ahead. That will be quite rough, but then I also believe that in a few years' time we will have much more clarity and better governance around tariff systems and reimbursement pretty much across the GCC.
Right. Well, that's something to look forward to. Afsani, I was going to come to you in terms of Pancho's point about you know, your analysts trying to predict in these especially where a payee might be a government body, a public payer. How do you deal with that risk?
No, it's a great question. And I think one of the exciting trends that we see, but also one of the things that exacerbates this problem, is the shift towards universal healthcare, right? So very recently, Morocco announced the shift towards universal healthcare. A lot of sub-Saharan African countries, not necessarily the focus of this conversation, have made commitments to do that. I think one of the things we probably worry about, especially in recent times, is, you know, healthcare services, some input of it, whether it's PPE, whether it's medication, is dollarized, and governments have gone through what has had, you know, like a very significant fiscal stimulus to support post-pandemic. So that's eating up a lot of their dollars. But revenues tend to be in local currency. So it is putting pressure on public finances, and it will eventually, unfortunately, as do all of these, most of these economies go through periods of devaluation. What we have also kind of come to realize, and I've come to realize, I've been investing in the healthcare space sort of 15 years, is, you know, governments are very bad at doing complicated things, but they are very good at spending money.
Yeah.
And so we think some of the more successful models have been where governments do kind of some sort of public-private partnership with service providers that, you know, they set up, you know, state-run insurance companies, maybe even the private sector helps manage the insurance companies, manage the risk, and then they provision services to the private sector, which ultimately makes the services less expensive. And you've seen that in the UK, you've seen it in Europe, you're starting to see it in places like Morocco and Egypt, where, you know, for example, in the cancer space, when they allowed private capital to invest in cancer therapy, wait times massively decreased and efficacy increased, right? So that should actually put less pressure on public finances. We as an investor do like to see a balance of sort of private insurance and public insurance. And I think as an investor, what we tend to do is in sectors where there is, or in companies, or in sectors or companies or countries where there's a very large portion of government funded reimbursement, we tend to provision, and we tend to make sure that that we have the cash flow. So I do think governments usually always pay, but it's not unusual in a lot of these markets to have sort of 180 days, 360-day receivables for sort of large provisioning, right? So you know you'll probably always get paid because the government in a lot of ways needs you more than you need them, in just very categorically, but they also have a lot of leverage that they will just stretch, especially in times of economic stress or fiscal stimulus, they will stretch out the reimbursement. So you just need to be able to buttress yourself and try and diversify your revenues to sort of private payers or out of pocket as much as possible.
Abhishek, I'm just going to go to you next to sort of just look at that sort of cluster point. But in my experience, let's look at Saudi. I mean, I think the percentage of their healthcare budget is actually quite high, and a lot of money has been spent over the years on trying to do that. Question: how much of that do you think has been a success? Because in my view, they seem to reinvent things every few years, and it never gets to where it needs to be. Is that changing, do you think?
So I guess in this case, Hamid, I'll answer first, maybe personally in this thing, and it's Saudi, but maybe a GCC broader point, right? So we moved to the GCC as a family in the early 90s, late 80s. And, you know, there's some parallels in this case, which is on education and on healthcare. Initially, I think literally all of us, we went to school for a few years here. We went to boarding school outside, and then we went to college outside, right? That's changed a lot of, and people now end up finishing the schooling and colleges also to some extent. Healthcare is the same. For a large chunk, if anything was just basic, and literally what the word basic comes to mind, you know, we just did it here in the UAE or Saudi. But anything complex, if you're a Western expat, you went west. If you're a person from the Indian subcontinent and stuff, you went east. And that's how life was So the capacity gaps and all of these were really not such a big issue. And the locals in this case, were often allowed to go to a Mayo Clinic or a Bupa, and that's how the system was for a large part. Today, so to your direct point on where the money has been spent, first part, the capacity was built up, right? Now, as Dr. Pancho mentioned, we have enough hospitals. So then it comes into really the next part, which is the quality of the ecosystem.
Exactly.
And then the third part is the affordability in this case. And it's sometimes the chicken and egg, right? If I'm really, really hungry, guess what? I'm okay eating, a vegan burger. It doesn't matter, even if it's not amazingly gourmet. If I'm not so hungry, then I'm fine. I'll just manage and I'll pick and choose. So this is where the problem in the entire ecosystem is, where the money is being spent. It really is it in the building of the capacity or not? And where that's a hard one to say, wasted or not. What I can, at least what the data shows in this case, is I don't think we're anymore in an access problem. So that's done to a large extent. At least there are facilities to go to often, unless someone's talking about some very complex care or unique things. It really is now about standardization of quality and about affordability. So those are the bigger themes we're seeing to a large extent. And how does the ecosystem really work as a ecosystem? And that really ties into the cluster, which I'm happy to talk about from a government
Please,
initiative.
why did you take that question about the cluster? I mean, I should point out some of the people in the audience have started to ask questions. One of them has come through from Alan Hughes. Abhishek, you saw the question. Please, could you comment on the KSA healthcare cluster formation in terms of progress and upcoming milestones? Please, why didn't you take that? Because I think there's a natural flow from what you were saying.
Sure. So the initial disclaimer, and again, there's Cyril and Pancho who will, correct me, always in Saudi and in the GCC. The good part, it's a young dynamic region. The bad part, it's a young dynamic region. So there's a lot of regulations which come out and a lot of regulations which get folded in. So, in this case, what is the cluster strategy just for the wider group? The country has been broken up into 10 healthcare clusters. That's what's happened. 3 in Riyadh, 2 in Jeddah, 5 for the rest of the country. Each of the clusters has their own CEO. And the last time I checked, 9 out of the 10 had been hired. I think Jeddah was pending, and I think that person's been appointed. They're all empowered to design and deliver the healthcare infrastructure to deliver on the needs of the catchment area. So that's the first part, just in terms of the figures itself. If I can give a case study, and I won't name which cluster, one of the clusters which we're close to, just to go through some numbers, 2.5 billion Saudi Riyal budget, which is 800 and so of $800 million of budget. 92 facilities come under that cluster. In this case of the clusters, 5 are really what's called a pathfinder cluster, where call it those are the trailblazers. And once the clusters find a solution, the others copy. That's basically what it is. Not all the data is right now synchronous, so that's in terms of technology and digitization, that's still a work in progress. The great part is there are weekly huddles for the cluster CEOs, and main focus is the practice, best practice sharing. The minister is also very, very hands-on. There are many KPI dashboards in this case, and the big shift is how do you use over time, to a large extent, the involvement of the private sector to fill in the gap. So that's where some of the themes which come in is, some people see things like CCHI disappearing, and maybe a company like Bupa or Tamunia taking on a larger theme. But that's to give you a sense of how dynamic the regulation is, how the clusters are being formed, some of the smartest individuals coming in to lead it. And this is where the country is going through truly a transformational phase in the most positive way. Is it a straight line? No, but change is never easy. That's what it is.
Thanks, Abhishek. That's really, really helpful. We've got 20 minutes left at least going forward, and I want to perhaps towards the end just open it up to questions from the audience. I mean, throughout the proceedings, if anybody does want to ask a question, please do send it through on the chat, and at the end we can see whether we can join you into the video as well. All of us have said, and again, the global health trends, 2 of them in particular, or more than 2, talked about data analytics, the use of data. other aspects were the technological developments of telehealth, digital technology, artificial intelligence, and so on. Cyril, just uh, asking you, I mean, do you see um, that? Do you see more of that happening? Do you see more of that happening in the region than other areas of the world? And do you see any problems on the landscape as a result of the fast pace that things are happening? For instance, there's no one regulatory framework that's covering a lot of the product development, and that's also consistent with the question that we got from a fantastic young lady called Katerina Toma. I think she might be related to you, Cyril, but there you go. Come on, Cyril, over to you.
Look, I think there's no way back. This is happening now. I'll take one of the top 3 US hospitals during the pandemic have witnessed outpatient numbers going down by 60%. What was their reaction to it? They've accelerated the plans they had already for their e-health strategy. It doesn't mean they're doing something new. They just got the resources and had the energy and drive to accelerate the process. And what this led to is them coming to a conclusion that irrespective of how this pandemic is going to pan out, they will never go back to where they were before with their outpatient clinics. They'll just reduce the number of outpatient clinics, and they've made a decision to cut outpatient clinics by 40%. This is one of the most prominent hospitals in the US. And this is happening across the world. If you look at even smaller hospitals in the UAE or in Saudi Arabia, everyone wants to be part of this e-health wave, I would call it. And more often than not, people are using a better type of Skype, but they know if they don't advertise that they're into e-health, then they get left behind. Now, in order for this to really succeed, there's going to be a number of steps that need to be taken. You need to analyze what technology you have. You need to invest into that technology, and you need to commit to it. You need to train your people to do that. You need to redefine your model of care. You have to work within a regulatory environment that gives you confidence that what you do is actually legal and is being reimbursed, because that's another question, is what is being reimbursed. And that's often, if you talk to someone, you go to your insurance company, say, listen, I had a discussion with my patient. It would have been the same if they came to the clinic, and the insurance company may say, look, we're not reimbursing that. So that then obviously defeats the purpose. And then there is another important thing that you've mentioned is medical equipment. If they come into a market, they have to go through a stringent accreditation and review process and get licensed in different countries. Pharmaceuticals is the same. If you look into personalized healthcare solutions, personal health solutions, this is just it's just starting, where people look at the risks of apps being floated into the market, and you don't even know how it's going to be used. Now, different jurisdictions are reacting at different speeds to trying to solve this issue. And it's not just about the apps, but it's also about what's going to happen to data. People talk about AI all the time. There is a good study where they looked at claims where people said we're using AI. In fact, less than 20% of those claiming to use AI had a true artificial intelligence platform that was behind it. The rest was just to use that particular buzzword. And the last thing I'd like to raise here is for organizations themselves to look at something which, and I love this term, it's called a corporate digital responsibility of how do you, as an organization, work with the data that you collect and what types of e-health tools are you using? Are you making sure that these have been tried and tested, and are you not subjecting your patients to harm simply because you want to be part of this wave where everything is around e-health, telemedicine, robotics, AI, blockchain, all of these buzzwords that are being used by so many organizations. So for me, that's an important one in terms of this corporate digital responsibility, and healthcare leaders are really, they need to think about this at the same time as thinking about the care delivery aspect and the business aspect of e-health. But it's going to come, Hamid, to answer your question. There is no way back, and it doesn't make sense to go back to this brick and mortar type of healthcare. And this will introduce a lot more opportunities, a lot more flexibility into the market, and obviously will make investors happy because they see that there is a significant disruption in the market.
Just taking that slightly forward, thank you for that, Cyril. I think some great points there, some very apt points there. Had you just taken that forward, if you had to look at the MENA region, and it's a difficult question because there's no one region, in my view. But let's take the GCC, because I think that's probably something that's, identifiable. Do you see the take-up of digital technology or the other aspects of that as quick as other areas in the world? Let's take out the US, let's take out some of the countries in Europe, but maybe are you seeing the take-up of that technology as quick as it is in other parts of the world?
I think it is quicker than the average of the rest of the world. Why? Because they have a really good telecommunications network.
Yeah.
The number of mobile phones per inhabitant is there is no comparison to any other parts in the world. People are very used to live that life where, food is ordered via app, cars are ordered via, that has been, and it's a young population. So the young population in general is much more receptive to using these modern tools of communication. That's the one part, that's the consumer behavior and the experience they've had. But from a governmental and a regulatory perspective, I mean, we can talk about Abu Dhabi as a good example. And this is the market that I would say I would know most about. But the Abu Dhabi government is clearly dedicated towards supporting these new technologies, not just from the regulatory side, but also providing incentives, trying to work in the public-private partnerships. They're putting it under an umbrella. They're seeing, okay, this is a development. This is where our workforce can can contribute. This is nothing where we have to invest significantly into infrastructure, and they're hugely supportive. And they do realize that they need to put forward specific frameworks for how this could be done, other than just injecting money into this, but also looking at the legal side, at the regulatory side. And I think Abu Dhabi has been very good at doing that. In fact,
that was my other question, which I was going to go put to Pancho. Just say a quick word on what Cyril was saying there. Whilst it's a young, very dynamic population in the GCC, are you also seeing that from the government side, that the take-up of what's available or listening to what's available is pretty apparent? Pancho, do you agree with what Cyril was saying there?
Yeah, I would totally agree with what Cyril is saying, and I think this is probably an aspect where nobody was really prepared. Right. If you look, there was a WHO assessment last year that was looking at the preparedness of countries to deal with big data and telemedicine and rollout of digital health and the regulatory side of it. And there's only like 17% of countries that even have had a policy or some clarity on regulations and what that means for telehealth, right? To what Cyril was describing before. I mean, how do you know that a physician at the other end is actually licensed in your jurisdiction or not, right? These are problems that, as long as telehealth was 0.5% of the consultations, were not really top of their agenda. And I would say that, quite frankly, some of the geographies or some of the authorities in this part of the world were more forward thinking than some of them in Europe or other parts of the world. And I think Cyril was speaking to Abu Dhabi, which is certainly a very good example, where they picked this up actually relatively early on. So fully in line with what Cyril was describing.
Fantastic. Look, we're coming towards the last 10 minutes, and we've got a couple of questions that have come in from the audience. Asane, one of them is specifically in relation to Morocco. Can I ask you to address that one? The question for everybody else is, how is the private healthcare service sector in Morocco faring during COVID? Numerous press reports about potential bankruptcies, but also clinics charging extortionate amounts to patients for COVID care. Will that erode trust? Sani, do you want to take that one?
Yeah. So I think COVID has been traumatic for every country in different ways, right? And particularly more for sort of low income, middle income countries, because they were really not well prepared. I think one of the things the Moroccan government did very well is well, arguably from a public health perspective, what they did very well is went through a very austere lockdown very early and took very, very stringent precautions around how to treat COVID patients. So for example, if someone gets COVID, special ambulances have to come and get them and take them to COVID secure units. So their COVID was being taken care of in public units, of which, there's a limited number, and the public finances are, all the more limited at the moment, given my comments from earlier that public finances, especially those related to healthcare, are under a huge amount of pressure. I think the public healthcare sector in Morocco is quite varied in that there are sort of 3 or 4 very large, well-capitalized players, most of them now with sort of FDI, private equity capital. And then there's like a litany of sort of smaller standalone 1 or 2 clinics. And I think there has been financial stress in the sector for the smaller clinics. Unfortunately, and we saw this in our own business, right? And luckily we were capitalized in a way where it didn't necessarily affect us. But during the lockdown, you would imagine things like cancer care would be quite inelastic and would not see volumes drop, but actually people stopped coming to chemotherapy. People stopped going for referrals. People stopped, they definitely stopped going to get their knee and shoulder MRIs, that they literally just stopped everything. And so some of the smaller clinics have suffered. I think the other challenge with COVID, and maybe this will allow governments, hopefully there's not another pandemic, but I would imagine that's not going to be the case, to better plan to sort of how to pay for these services, because people with COVID would show up at private clinics not knowing where else to go, and there was I think maybe now there's some guidance on reimbursement and pricing, but the government can't really pay for treatment, so clinics were just left to come up with a pricing plan. So like our clinic doesn't do that. We don't treat COVID patients. We've been asked for the government to allocate some beds for COVID that we are going to be treating at a highly subsidized level. We're also actually looking at renting new hospitals specifically to treat COVID patients, but it does seem like the pandemic is getting under control. On the other hand, we are a buyer of assets and we are quite acquisitive. So some of the assets that may be under financial distress, we are looking to acquire. And so hopefully that maintains trust in the market. And I think generally people do appreciate the private healthcare sector because it has come with a lot of other positive externalities, like freeing up space in the public sector, decreasing wait times. The private sector tend to have better outcomes, and we actually price at the reimbursement rate of the government, or the guidance. So hopefully those things will counteract any temporary negative measures around trust in the system.
Sure. Sani, that's really helpful. There was another question that's come through, and I'm going to open it up to Abhishek in the first instance, and then Pancho, Cyril, if you wanted to comment as well. I think the question is, how are private providers in the GCC, especially in Saudi and the UAE, responding to the declining expat population? Abhishek, I think you referred partly to it, where I think if people hailed from the west, they looked west. If you hailed from the east, you looked east. In terms of an expat population. And I think there's different dynamics on a decline from where people came from. Certain places, yes, there's a decline. In others, there is no change. But do you see that having an effect on private providers in the GCC and Saudi and UAE in particular?
So, I guess again, in terms of just some data around this, right? So at least what we have is, I think Bupa does a really good job. It's a publicly listed company. They disclose the financials, how many people actually leaving and coming. And I think the trend is consistently in Saudi Arabia, especially, is that around 2 million expats have left the country in the last couple of years. So, again, it's not a straight line, but it is trending down. And that's the new reality we face. As a private provider and us who has been invested in various private providers, what we have seen, Hamid, is there's really only 5 ways to differentiate in a very crowded market. And, we keep saying we should trademark this, but it's brand, its scale, its experience, partnerships, and team. And that's literally the holy grail. So if we literally go through those things, and I know we're running out, to the direct question on how we're responding to the declining expat population, the sea becomes smaller or the pond is smaller, and literally it comes back to scale in the first instance. Because while there's expat population declining, what that also means is corporates are tightening their belts and in most
Yeah.
cases willing to pay less for these expats. So right there, affordability comes back to in this case. And the only way to get the economics working is to redirect the patient flow and the clinical pathways into making sure utilization goes up. So
Yeah.
in this case, at least what we're seeing with the private providers is there's more efficiency taking place. The hospitals are realizing in this case, a lot of the cases where we're able to do the good old 1,000 patients seen and 3 to 5% conversion into inpatient, it will not work because the insurers are beating down. And it literally is coming back to focusing on the brand, scale, partnerships, experience, and team. There's a lot of public data in this case for the guys on the call, which actually details quite extensively Warren Astor is doing, Suleiman Habib, Muasat, the big listed companies. We ourselves on the primary healthcare side are a private provider, and diversifying our revenue base predominantly away from blue collar expats to, in this case, oil and gas and government. So that's more on the sales side. And then similarly with the insurance side, there's preferred partnerships, which are now taking place, which are meant to be win-win partnerships. How do we get a more sustainable way of working with insurers also?
Abhishek, that's really helpful. Cyril, just over to you for a last word. I think we come into time, and then Pancho, I'll finish with you. And you can see the beautiful symmetry of my moderation here. So Cyril, you go first.
Yeah, I really don't think I have to add a lot to Abhishek. So the question was very clearly, is how are private providers in the GCC responding to the declining expat population? The answer in one word is they're responding badly, because it's a huge drop in their revenues, and the rest was said by Abhishek. So nothing to add there really.
Pancho?
I would I would agree to what Cyril said, right? I think the immediate response is also difficult. I think two observations. One is providers over the last, not just now during COVID, but even before, over the last 2-3 years, when it started to become evident that there is too much capacity for the demand, started to seriously engage in looking at their cost base. Procurement programs, FTE costs, etc., which was never the case before, right? It was all growth and all big margins. I think the mindset is shifting where, to Abhishek's point as well, efficiency, productivity is becoming a real topic and has become over the last few years already. I think the second thing is, it's one thing is expats, but I think the systems are also opening up, right? The public system starts to serve private patients. The private sector starts to serve public patients. So I think the funding schemes and what is, I think it's going to be much more fluid what actually public and private is. And that also opens opportunities, right? So the well-positioned providers that have a real value proposition will tap into the right patients if they are efficient and they have a clear profile. So I think it's not all just dark, right? There are opportunities if you reorient.
I think the other thing I would say as well is you are seeing it's not a big flowing river yet, but you're seeing a stream of providers in the region who grew in the region, looking at opportunities outside of the region as well. And so that's one way to mitigate any decrease in their business in the region as well. So look, we've reached 2 o'clock UK time, past 2 o'clock UK time, and I just wanted to thank all of you for some fantastic insights. Afsane, Abhishek, Pancho, and Cyril, some great insights into what's happening in the region. I think we could talk for the rest of the afternoon and develop some of these themes as well, but time has caught up